Close your eyes. Imagine a mountain. Not a gentle hill, not a rounded, forested slope. A mountain in the true sense, the Alps in autumn, when the passes are already dusted with the first snow of the season, and the wind comes down from the peaks like a wall of cold that hits you in the chest and takes your breath away. Now imagine crossing it. Not with modern equipment, not with roads and tunnels and heated vehicles, on foot, with 50,000 soldiers, 9,000 cavalry and 37 war elephants. In 218 BC, in the space of 15 days. When you reach the other side, you have lost perhaps half your army to cold and rockfall and ambushes by mountain tribes. The elephants are mostly dead. Your men are exhausted, hungry, frostbitten. The horses are stumbling. And below you, stretching out in the autumn light, is Italy. And somewhere beyond Italy, 4 weeks' march to the south, is Rome. The man who did this was 30 years old. He had sworn at the age of 9, before the altar of the gods of Carthage, that he would never be a friend of Rome. He kept that promise for the next 55 years. His name was Hannibal Barca. Tonight we tell his story, one of the most extraordinary military careers in the ancient world. A man who crossed the Alps, destroyed Roman army after Roman army, spent 15 years inside Italy never losing a battle, and was ultimately defeated not by Rome but by his own city's failure to support him. It's the man who came closer than anyone to ending the Roman Republic. And what happened to him when Rome had its revenge? So settle in, let the mountain wind come, let the campfire burn, and let history carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. Carthage. To understand Hannibal, you first need to understand the city he was fighting for. Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Tunisia, Carthage had grown over 7 centuries from a small trading post into the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean. Its harbor was one of the finest in the ancient world. Its merchants traded from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the eastern Mediterranean. Its navy was the most powerful in the sea. The Carthaginians were not, despite what the Romans later said about them, a cruel or barbaric people. They were sophisticated, commercially brilliant, religiously complex. Their city had public baths, paved streets, multi-story buildings. Their art drew on both Phoenician and Egyptian and Greek traditions. Their religion centered on the great god Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit, though the question of whether they practiced child sacrifice, as the Romans claimed, is one that historians still debate without resolution. What they were above all was traders, merchants, a people who understood the sea routes and the commodity prices and the diplomatic arrangements that kept the flow of goods moving across the Mediterranean. They were not, by inclination, a military people. This would matter, because the power they faced, Rome, was nothing but a military people at its core. A society built around the legions, around the discipline of the soldier, around the willingness to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. The collision between these two civilizations, the trading city and the military republic, produced 3 wars. They are called the Punic Wars from the Latin word for Phoenician. The First Punic War lasted from 264 to 241 BC. It was fought primarily at sea, around the island of Sicily. Rome, a land power that had never had a significant navy, built one almost from scratch, learning as it went, and eventually defeated Carthage after 23 years of brutal fighting. The peace treaty stripped Carthage of Sicily, its richest province, the jewel of its Western empire. And when civil war broke out in Carthage shortly afterward, Rome seized the moment and took Sardinia and Corsica as well. The humiliation was total. Into this world of defeat and resentment, Hannibal Barca was born in 247 BC. Part 2: The Father and the Oaths. Hannibal's father was Hamilcar Barca. The surname Barca, in the Punic language of Carthage, meant lightning or thunderbolt, a surname acquired by Hamilcar on account of the swiftness and ferocity of his attacks. Hamilcar Barca was the finest Carthaginian general of the First Punic War, a man who had fought the Romans to a standstill in Sicily while the rest of the war went badly, who had never been defeated in the field, who had been forced to accept a humiliating peace that he had no part in negotiating. He spent the years after the First Punic War rebuilding Carthaginian power in Spain, compensating for the lost provinces of Sicily and Sardinia by carving out a new empire on the Iberian Peninsula, with its silver mines and its warrior peoples who made excellent soldiers. He took his son with him. Hannibal was 9 years old when he begged his father to take him on the Spanish campaign. He wanted to go to war. He was a child, and he wanted to go to war. Hamilcar asked him, "Do you understand what it means to go with the army?" Hannibal said he did. Hamilcar took him to the altar. He made him swear before the gods that he would never be a friend of Rome. The Roman historian Livy may have embellished this story. The Carthaginian sources are mostly lost, but the oath, Hannibal's vow of eternal enmity to Rome, runs through every account of his life like a thread. Whether it happened exactly as described, something in Hamilcar's son absorbed a hatred of Rome so deep and so total that it defined everything he did for the next 55 years. Hamilcar died in 229 BC in battle in Spain. Hannibal was 18. Command passed to Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the Spanish campaign with considerable political skill, extending Carthaginian control northward and founding the city of Carthago Nova in New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, as the capital of the new Spanish Empire. Hasdrubal negotiated a treaty with Rome, the Ebro Treaty, establishing the Ebro River as the boundary between the Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence in Spain. North of the Ebro was Roman, south of it was Carthaginian. Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, and the army in Spain, by acclamation, chose its new commander. Hannibal was 26 years old. Part 3: The Rise to Command. Hannibal's assumption of command in Spain was, by the ancient sources, immediate and decisive. The army loved him. He had grown up with them, had campaigned alongside them since childhood, had learned the craft of war not in an academy but in the field, watching his father and his brother-in-law manage the complex business of keeping a multi-ethnic mercenary army functioning in hostile territory. He knew how to eat the same food as his men. He slept in the same conditions. He was always visible, always present, always at the point of danger. He wore no special clothing to distinguish himself from his soldiers. He was recognizable, the ancient sources say, only by his authority, by the quality of attention he brought to every situation. He was also, even at 26, clearly a military thinker of extraordinary sophistication. He had studied the Greek military tradition, Alexander the Great's campaigns, the tactical innovations of the Hellenistic world. He had watched how his father managed battles. He had absorbed everything the ancient world knew about the art of war. And he had formed a grand strategic vision that was unlike anything any Carthaginian had attempted before. The First Punic War had been fought for Sicily. The peace had been humiliating. The Carthaginian Senate was cautious, mercantile, unwilling to risk another war. Hannibal was not going to wait for Rome to attack Carthage again. He was going to attack Rome. Not from the sea. Rome had a navy now, and the approach by sea was expected, predictable, easily countered. He was going to attack from the north, through Spain, through southern Gaul, over the Alps, into Italy itself. He was going to bring the war to Rome's own territory, to fight it among Rome's own allies, to demonstrate to the cities and peoples of Italy that Rome was not invincible. If he could peel Rome's Italian allies away from the Roman alliance, if he could show them that Rome could be beaten, that there was a better option available, then Rome would be isolated. Its military strength depended on Italian manpower, Italian grain, Italian loyalty. Without those things, the Republic would collapse. It was a brilliant strategy. It nearly worked. Part 4. The provocation. Hannibal needed a cause for war. Rome was not going to attack Carthage unprovoked, not yet. He needed to create the provocation that would trigger the conflict on his terms at the moment of his choosing. He found it in the city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a prosperous city on the eastern coast of Spain, south of the Ebro River, in the Carthaginian sphere of influence according to the Ebro Treaty. But Rome had made an alliance with Saguntum, treating it as a Roman ally and protectorate. In 219 BC, Hannibal marched on Saguntum and besieged it. The siege lasted 8 months. The Romans sent embassies protesting. Hannibal took the city. Rome demanded that Carthage hand Hannibal over for punishment. Carthage refused. Rome declared war. The Second Punic War had begun, exactly as Hannibal had planned. The Romans dispatched armies, one to Spain to intercept Hannibal before he could leave, one to North Africa to strike directly at Carthage. They expected the war to be fought either in Spain or in Africa. They were thinking conventionally in the framework of the First Punic War. Hannibal was already moving. Part 5. The Crossing. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal left Carthago Nova with his army. The ancient sources disagree on the precise numbers, they always do. He probably had around 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry and 37 war elephants when he crossed the Ebro River. By the time he reached the Pyrenees, he had perhaps 40,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. He had left garrisons along the route and dismissed those soldiers who seemed unwilling for what was coming. He crossed the Pyrenees through the mountain passes in the summer, fighting the local tribes who tried to block his path. He crossed southern Gaul with extraordinary speed, covering ground that would have taken a conventional army weeks in days. He crossed the Rhone River, a broad, fast-flowing river that presented a serious obstacle. He ferried the elephants across on large rafts, reportedly causing chaos when the animals, terrified by the water, capsized some of them, but all were recovered. And then the Alps loomed ahead. Autumn had come, the passes were already snowing. The local tribes were hostile, watching from the heights above the narrow paths, ready to roll boulders down on the column below to ambush the stragglers to cut off the supply train. The Romans, when they heard that Hannibal was attempting to cross the Alps in autumn, were not alarmed. They were incredulous. Nobody crossed the Alps in autumn. That was the point. The crossing took 15 days. It was brutal beyond description. The paths were narrow, icy, crumbling. Pack animals fell into gorges, men slipped and died. The cold was savage, food ran short. Local tribes launched attacks that the exhausted army had to fight off while also managing the treacherous terrain. The elephants, those enormous, terrifying, magnificent creatures, struggled most of all. The cold, the altitude, the ice, most of them died on the crossing or shortly afterward. When Hannibal reached the Italian side and looked down at the plain of the Po Valley below, he reportedly called his men together and spoke to them. He told them what lay before them, the richest land in the world, the reward for what they had endured. He told them that the hard part was behind them, that from here the road led downward. He had lost perhaps half his original force. He had perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry remaining. He was in Italy. Part 6. The early victories. The Romans sent an army to meet Hannibal in the Po Valley before he could recover and resupply. At the Battle of Ticinus, a cavalry engagement on the banks of the Ticinus River, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry swept the Roman horsemen from the field. The Roman commander, the consul Scipio, was severely wounded and saved from death only by his young son, who would grow up to become Scipio Africanus, the man who eventually defeated Hannibal. History contains certain ironies that seem almost deliberately constructed. A larger Roman force arrived. At the Battle of Trebia in December 218 BC, Hannibal destroyed it. He had set an ambush, 2,000 cavalry hidden in the tall grass near the riverbank, waiting. He provoked the Romans into crossing the freezing Trebia River in the early morning, before they had eaten, before they had warmed themselves. When they crossed, exhausted and cold and hungry, he hit them from the front. Then the cavalry emerged from the ambush and hit them from behind and the flanks. The Roman army was annihilated. Perhaps 25,000 men killed. The survivors fled through the winter cold. It was a catastrophe, but it was a minor catastrophe compared to what was coming. Part 7. Lake Trasimene. In the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal moved south through the Apennine Mountains toward Etruria, the region of central Italy. A new Roman army, under the consul Gaius Flaminius, moved to intercept him. Flaminius was aggressive, politically ambitious, eager for a decisive victory that would end the Carthaginian threat quickly and give him the glory he craved. Hannibal understood this. He set a trap of breathtaking scale. Lake Trasimene in Etruria was flanked by hills that curved around the northern shore of the lake, forming a natural amphitheater. The road ran along the lakeshore, the only practical route for a large army. Hannibal positioned his entire army in the hills above the road, hidden in the morning mist that rolled in off the lake. His rear guard was visible at the far end of the valley, drawing the Roman army forward. The mist concealed everything else. The Roman army, perhaps 30,000 men, marched into the valley in column, not in battle formation, following the visible enemy at the valley's end. Hannibal gave the signal. From the hills on three sides, the entire Carthaginian army poured down onto the road. The battle lasted 3 hours. It was not really a battle, it was a slaughter. The Romans were packed onto a narrow strip of land between the hills and the lake, unable to form a battle line, unable to maneuver, unable to do anything but die where they stood. Some tried to escape into the lake and drowned. Some were pushed in by the press of bodies behind them. Flaminius was killed. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours. It was the largest ambush in ancient military history. The road to Rome was open. Part 8. Fabius the Delayer. Rome's response to the disaster at Lake Trasimene was to appoint a dictator. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius understood something that the Roman people and Roman Senate were desperately unwilling to accept, that Hannibal could not be defeated in open battle. Not yet. Not until Rome had rebuilt its army, restored its confidence, and found generals capable of matching what they were facing. His strategy was simple and deeply unpopular. Follow Hannibal, shadow him, harass his supply lines, cut off foragers, pick off isolated detachments, avoid any engagement that might become a pitched battle. Deny Hannibal what he needed most, a decisive victory that would convince Rome's Italian allies to defect. It worked. It was the right strategy. History has vindicated Fabius completely. The Roman people called him the delayer. They meant it as an insult. They replaced him. They elected two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, and gave them the largest army Rome had ever put in the field. 86,000 men against Hannibal's 50,000. They were going to end this with one decisive battle. Part 9, Cannae, August 2nd, 216 BC. The plain near the village of Cannae in Apulia, southeastern Italy. The two armies faced each other across the flat ground. The Romans deployed in the formation they had always used, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks. But this time, learning from Trebia and Trasimene, they deepened their infantry formation dramatically. A dense, massive block of soldiers that would simply push through whatever was in front of it through sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal looked at the Roman formation and understood exactly what they were planning to do. He arranged his army in a shape that has been studied in military academies for 2,000 years. He placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and Spaniards, in the center of his line, in a gentle convex curve that bulged toward the Romans. On either flank of this center, set slightly back, were his best infantry, the elite African veterans who had crossed the Alps with him. On the wings, his cavalry. The battle began. The Roman infantry advanced and hit the Carthaginian center. The Gauls and Spaniards fought hard, but slowly, they began to give ground. The convex curve flattened. Then it became concave, curving inward, drawing the Roman mass forward and inward into the deepening pocket. The Romans pushed forward. They were winning. The center was giving way. They pressed harder, packed more tightly, pushing into the collapsing Carthaginian line. They were now surrounded on three sides by the curving Carthaginian formation, and they were packed so tightly that the men in the middle couldn't raise their weapons. On the wings, Hannibal's cavalry had routed the Roman horsemen and swung around behind the Roman infantry. The African veterans on the flanks turned inward. The cavalry closed the rear. The Romans were surrounded on all four sides. What followed was not a battle, it was a killing ground. 50,000 Romans died that day, perhaps 70,000 by some ancient accounts, in a space of a few hours, including one of the two consuls, Aemilius Paulus, including 80 senators, including 2 quaestors and 29 of the 48 military tribunes. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. It remains, 2,000 years later, one of the most studied battles ever fought. The double envelopment, the encirclement of a larger force by a smaller one through superior tactical positioning, that Hannibal executed at Cannae, became the template for military thinking for the next 2 millennia. After the battle, Hannibal's cavalry commander Hannibal urged him to march on Rome immediately. "Let me go ahead with the cavalry," Hannibal reportedly said. "5 days from now you will dine on the Capitol." Hannibal refused. He did not have the siege equipment to take Rome. His army was exhausted. He needed to consolidate his position and wait for Carthage to send reinforcements. Hannibal's response has echoed through history ever since. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one. Part 10, The 15 Years. What happened after Cannae was one of the most remarkable things in the ancient world. Rome did not surrender. By every rational calculation it should have. It had lost 3 consular armies in 3 years. It had lost perhaps 100,000 soldiers. It had lost the Battle of Cannae, in which the mathematics of the situation were such that anyone observing would have said, "This republic is finished." Rome refused to accept the mathematics. The Senate met. No one was allowed to publicly mourn their dead. There was no time. The city's sacred institutions were invoked. The gold and silver dedicated to the temples were melted down to pay soldiers. Slaves were freed and armed. Boys too young for military service were conscripted. Any Roman who had surrendered to the Carthaginians and been ransomed was refused permission to return. Rome would not pay ransom, would not acknowledge that any Roman had the right to surrender. And they went back to the Fabian strategy. They appointed capable commanders who understood that Hannibal was not to be faced in open battle. They used multiple independent armies to constrain his movement, to protect their allied cities, to pick off his foragers and supply convoys. They stopped giving him the decisive engagement he needed. Several Italian cities did defect after Cannae, most importantly Capua, the second largest city in Italy, which opened its gates to Hannibal and became his base for several years. Some of the Greek cities in the south joined him. The kingdom of Macedon made an alliance with him. But the defections were fewer and less significant than Hannibal had hoped. The majority of Rome's Italian allies stayed loyal, partly out of genuine attachment to Rome, partly because they had seen what happened to cities that defected and were then recaptured by Roman forces. Hannibal moved through southern Italy. He won engagements. He demonstrated repeatedly that Roman armies that confronted him directly were destroyed, but he could not take the major cities. He did not have siege equipment. He did not have the engineers. He did not have enough men. And Carthage did not send reinforcements. This is the part of the story that haunts every account of Hannibal's Italian campaign. Carthage had the resources to support him. It had armies in Spain, in North Africa. If it had committed to the war with the same total dedication that Rome committed to its defense, the outcome might have been different. It did not. The Carthaginian Senate was dominated by a faction led by Hanno the Great, who had opposed the war from the beginning and who used every setback to argue that Hannibal's campaign was futile, that peace should be sought. The reinforcements Hannibal requested came in trickles, never enough, never on time. He was winning every battle and slowly losing the war. Part 11 SCIPIO. While Hannibal was fighting his 15-year campaign in Italy, something was happening on the other side of the Roman world. In Spain, where Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal commanded the Carthaginian forces, a young Roman general had arrived who would change everything. Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was 24 years old when the Roman Senate, desperately short of competent commanders, gave him command of the forces in Spain. The more experienced men had refused the command, believing after Cannae that it was a suicide mission. Scipio volunteered. He was the son of the consul who had been wounded at Ticinus. His father and uncle had both been killed fighting Hasdrubal in Spain. He had a personal score to settle. He began in Spain, not Italy, understanding, with strategic clarity beyond his years, that the way to defeat Hannibal was not to face him directly but to cut off the route of his support, destroy the Carthaginian position in Spain, and Hannibal's hope of reinforcement was gone. He took the city of Carthago Nova, Hannibal's base in Spain, by a bold amphibious assault that caught the garrison completely off guard. He moved through Spain with the same combination of speed and tactical innovation that Hannibal had shown in Italy. He defeated Hasdrubal at the Battle of Baecula in 208 BC, using the same double envelopment tactic that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae. He learned from his enemy. Hasdrubal, recognizing that Spain was lost, crossed the Alps to join his brother in Italy for a united attack on Rome. He never reached Hannibal. At the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 BC, Roman forces intercepted and destroyed Hasdrubal's army. Hasdrubal was killed. Hannibal learned of his brother's death when the Romans threw Hasdrubal's severed head into the Carthaginian camp. He withdrew into the deep south of Italy. He had perhaps 12,000 veterans, the remnant of the army that had crossed the Alps 9 years earlier. He was still undefeated. But the war was now going to be decided somewhere else. Part 12 Zama. Scipio returned to Rome a hero and proposed the boldest strategic move of the entire war. Instead of continuing to contain Hannibal in Italy, where he had proved for 15 years that he could not be dislodged, Scipio proposed to invade Africa, to attack Carthage itself, force Hannibal to come home. The Senate was divided. The cautious faction argued that Hannibal was still in Italy, still dangerous, that invading Africa was reckless. Scipio prevailed. In 204 BC, he landed in North Africa with a Roman army. He began to ravage the Carthaginian homeland. Carthage recalled Hannibal. For the first time in 15 years, Hannibal left Italy. He had never been defeated there. He left voluntarily, called back by a city that had failed to support him properly and was now terrified of the consequences. He crossed to North Africa. He met Scipio. Before the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, the two men reportedly met in person, the two greatest generals of their age, facing each other across a plain in North Africa, negotiating the terms of the peace they both knew was coming. The negotiations failed. At Zama, Hannibal tried his elephant tactics, driving his war elephants forward to break the Roman line before the infantry engagement. Scipio had prepared for this. He had arranged his maniples with corridors between them, and when the elephants charged, they drove straight through the corridors without causing casualties, panicking and turning back into the Carthaginian flanks. The tactic that had terrified armies across the Mediterranean was used against its master. Hannibal's veterans fought with their usual discipline and skill, but Scipio had Numidian cavalry, the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, who had previously fought for Carthage but had switched sides, and at the critical moment, this cavalry swept around and hit the Carthaginian rear. It was Cannae in reverse. Hannibal was defeated for the first time in his life. The Battle of Zama ended the Second Punic War. The peace terms were brutal. Carthage surrendered its navy, its overseas territories, its independence in foreign policy. It became a Roman client state, paying an enormous indemnity over 50 years. Hannibal had come closer than anyone to destroying Rome. He had ended the war by losing one battle, on African soil, against a Roman general who had learned everything from watching him. Part 13 of The Statesman. What happened to Hannibal after Zama is a chapter that is often overlooked in accounts of his life. He returned to Carthage not as a defeated general living out his days in obscurity, but as a politician. In 196 BC, he was elected suffete, the chief magistrate of Carthage, roughly equivalent to a consul in Rome, and in that role he did something remarkable. He reformed Carthage. The city was financially devastated by the war indemnity it owed Rome. The burden was crushing. Hannibal investigated the finances, discovered that the aristocratic families who dominated Carthaginian politics had been systematically embezzling from the city's revenues. He pushed through reforms that eliminated the corruption and demonstrated that Carthage could pay the indemnity from its own resources without additional taxes on its citizens. He was a better peacetime administrator than anyone had expected. He understood systems, understood institutions, understood how power worked and how to make it work better. But Rome was watching. The Roman Senate was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of Hannibal in any position of authority. The man who had spent 15 years in Italy, who had destroyed Roman armies at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, who had terrified Rome as no enemy ever had, the Senate did not want him governing Carthage with competence and energy. They pressured Carthage to surrender him. In 195 BC, facing arrest, Hannibal fled. He was 62 years old, and he was not finished. Part 14, The Exile. Hannibal spent the last years of his life in exile, moving from court to court in the eastern Mediterranean, always just ahead of Roman pressure, always looking for a patron who might provide the resources for one more campaign against Rome. He went first to the Seleucid king Antiochus III in Syria, a powerful ruler who was contemplating war with Rome over his ambitions in Greece. Hannibal tried to get command of Antiochus's forces, to turn the coming war into the campaign he had always wanted to fight, a coordinated, multi-front assault on Roman power. Antiochus used him as an advisor but did not give him command. The war against Rome went badly. Antiochus was defeated in Greece and in Asia Minor. One of the peace terms Rome imposed was the surrender of Hannibal. Hannibal fled again to Crete, then to the court of Prusias, the king of Bithynia in what is now northwestern Turkey. He helped Prusias in a war against the neighboring kingdom of Pergamon, an ally of Rome. In a naval battle, he reportedly won by catapulting clay pots full of poisonous snakes onto the enemy ships. Even in old age, even in exile, even without the resources of a great empire behind him, Hannibal found ways to improvise. He was in his mid-60s. He had been fighting Romans in one way or another for most of his adult life. And Rome still feared him. A Roman embassy arrived at the court of Prusias, demanding Hannibal's surrender. Prusias, who was not a man of courage, agreed. Hannibal heard that his house was surrounded. He tried to escape through the 7 doors of the building, finding each one blocked by soldiers. He took the poison that he had carried with him for years, against exactly this moment. His last recorded words, as preserved by Plutarch, were, "Let us relieve the Romans of their fear, since they find it too long to wait for an old man's death." He died in approximately 183 BC. He was about 64 years old. Part 15, The Reckoning. What does Hannibal's story mean? He is remembered above all for the crossing of the Alps. That image, the war elephants in the snow, the army threading through the mountain passes in autumn, has captured the imagination of every generation since. It is one of the great acts of audacity in human history. He is remembered for Cannae, the battle that military academies still study, the double envelopment that became the template for offensive encirclement tactics across 2,000 years of warfare. Napoleon studied it. Patton studied it. The German generals who encircled Soviet armies in the early years of the Second World War were consciously applying principles derived from Hannibal's battle on an Italian plain in 216 BC. He is remembered as the greatest enemy Rome ever faced. Generations of Roman children were frightened by the phrase Hannibal ante-porters. Hannibal is at the gates, the bogeyman of the Roman world. But what does his story actually mean? It is, at its heart, a story about the limits of individual genius. Hannibal was, by almost universal agreement among ancient and modern military historians, one of the finest tactical commanders who ever lived. His ability to read a battlefield, to understand what his enemy was going to do and position his forces to exploit it, was extraordinary. He never lost a pitched battle in Italy, never in 15 years. And he lost the war. Because individual genius, however extraordinary, cannot substitute for institutional support. Carthage failed him. The reinforcements he needed never came. The political commitment that a war of that ambition required was never sustained. He was also perhaps the victim of his own greatest quality, his tolerance of the peoples he conquered, his refusal to devastate the Italian countryside, his policy of releasing Italian prisoners and sending them home with kind words about Carthaginian intentions was designed to peel Rome's allies away from the Roman alliance. It was the right policy, but it was not enough. Rome's hold on its Italian allies proved stronger than he had calculated. And there is the question of whether he should have marched on Rome after Cannae. Hannibal's accusation that Hannibal knew how to win a victory but not how to use one has haunted his memory ever since. The historians who have studied the question most carefully tend to think Hannibal was right, that Rome after Cannae could not have been taken without siege equipment that he didn't have, but the question remains open. What is certain is that after Cannae, Rome found the Fabian strategy and stuck to it. The window of maximum opportunity closed, and Hannibal never found another Cannae. He was the greatest general of his age. He was defeated by an institution, the Roman Republic, that was capable of absorbing losses that would have destroyed any other state, that could replace its armies and its generals and its treasury and keep fighting. Rome defeated Hannibal not by matching his genius, but by refusing to be destroyed by it. Part 16. What remained? After the Second Punic War, Carthage continued to exist as a Roman client state. For 50 years it paid its indemnity, rebuilt its commerce, prospered under the peace. And Rome watched. In 149 BC, Rome declared war on Carthage for the third time, the Third Punic War. The pretext was thin. The real reason was that Rome, watching Carthage recover its prosperity, could not tolerate the continued existence of the city. The elder statesman Cato ended every speech in the Senate on any subject with the same phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 146 BC, after a siege of 3 years, the city fell. The Romans went through it house by house for 6 days, fighting on every floor of every building as the defenders retreated upward. When it was over, the city was burned. The population that survived, perhaps 50,000 out of a city that had once held several 100,000, was sold into slavery. The site was salted, according to legend, so that nothing would ever grow there again. Modern historians are skeptical of this detail, but it captures the spirit of what Rome intended. Carthage was gone. The civilization that Hannibal had fought for, the trading city, the Phoenician culture, the worship of Baal, Hammon and Tanit, was erased from the Western Mediterranean as completely as Rome could manage. Hannibal had died 37 years before the final destruction. He did not live to see the end. But in a sense, he had always known it was coming. He had sworn at 9 years old that he would never be a friend of Rome. He kept that oath until his last breath. Whether it was enough, whether anything could have been enough, the history of the following 37 years suggests probably not. Rome was the kind of institution that simply did not lose, that absorbed catastrophe and kept fighting, that produced, when it needed them, generals like Scipio who were capable of learning from the greatest enemy they had ever faced and using his own methods against him. Hannibal never found a way to destroy that. Nobody did for another 600 years. Closing the mountain 80 night. And so the story of Hannibal Barca comes to rest. 64 years, from the boy at the altar swearing eternal enmity to Rome, to the old man surrounded by soldiers, drinking his poison, telling Rome that its fear of him was unnecessary now. The Alps in autumn and the elephants in the snow, the ambush at Lake Trasimene in the morning mist, the killing ground at Cannae and the question that echoes down 2,000 years, what if he had marched on Rome? 15 years in Italy, undefeated in the field, slowly losing the war that Carthage wouldn't fight properly, the head of his brother thrown into his camp, the long retreat to the south, the crossing back to Africa to face Scipio. Zama. And then the exile, the old general at the courts of Eastern kings, still thinking, still planning, still looking for the one more opportunity that never came. Let those images settle now, like snow on the mountain passes. The elephant struggling through the Col du Mont Genève in the October cold, the mist rising off Lake Trasimene on a June morning, the Roman dead at Cannae, bushels of gold rings stripped from their fingers and sent to Carthage as proof of victory. Let the names grow quiet. Hannibal, Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, Scipio, Mahabal, Fabius. The greatest general who never quite won the war he was fighting. There are no more passes to cross tonight. No more battles to plan, no more armies to encircle, no more 15-year campaigns in hostile territory with no reinforcements coming. Only the mountain and the snow and the long quiet dark. And sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.